knows Katrina by this point. Been here under 2 years. And a big contributor to the lab on many projects, and is working diligently on the Transformers project in particular. She's not usually somebody who's very nervous, but I think she feels as though she's about to swim a 100-meter breaststroke in some final somewhere. And Katrina's a former swimmer. But she's going to do a great job. Her studies have really come on a long way. I would suggest, for those of you who recall in detail her confirmation of candidature, pay particular attention to study 2, which has really come on and is a really interesting piece of work there. So, Katrina, over to you.
Thank you. All right, so I'm Katrina. Hi everyone, thanks for coming in today. I know it's end of the year, so it's nice to see everyone. So I'm going to go over the progress of my thesis so far, which is on understanding time use in children from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So to get started, I have a little overview of what I'm going to be talking about. So first we'll go over the progression of my first study, which is a systematic review looking at different movement behaviors. Now I'm going to be referring to movement behaviors a lot, so I just wanted to define that up front. So movement behaviors can refer to physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep. And I'm trying to look at a combination of these behaviors on health and non-health outcomes in children and adolescents. And in my second study, I kind of want to take that further and dive deeper into each of those different movement behaviors by domains. And I'll go into what that means later. And in my third study, I kind of want to bring that together and see if childhood time use or this different combinations of movement behaviors can affect their social mobility later on in life. So in the end, I want to see how this all incorporates in different socioeconomic status in children. Alright, so first, to understand my systematic review, we have to go into a past systematic review that was done by Saunders and colleagues in 2015. And they looked at the combination of all these movement behaviors. And there's been a real big push at this lately instead of just studying these individually. And I'll go into why. So we're pretty familiar with physical activity, which can decrease adiposity and decrease risk of maybe developing diabetes and increasing fitness, where excessive sedentary time can do the opposite. It can increase adiposity and risks of developing different diseases. And insufficient sleep can do the same. It's been associated with the increased adiposity if you have too much or too little, and different health factors. So you might have realized that there is a common theme amongst all of these different movement behaviors. And within a day, if you're doing any one of these behaviors, you're taking time away from the other ones. So they are always interrelated and connected. So it's really important to study them in combination with each other instead of in isolation. So what this review found when they studied everything together is that children that experienced more high physical activity and low sedentary behaviors actually had better health indicators than children that did the opposite. And this was also true when they got sleep involved. So high sleep and physical activity and low sedentary behavior were more indicative of better health indicators than children that did the opposite. And this review was actually the basis of the Canadian 24-hour movement behavior guidelines. I don't expect you to read the whole thing, but if you look at the first line, it specifically says a healthy 24-hour includes, and you'll notice that they mention sleep, moderate to vigorous physical activity, light physical activity, recreational screen time, and sitting time. So now instead of just giving one recommendation now, we're giving recommendations for everything. So there's been definitely a push for that. So what I want to look at is different combinations of physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep on health and non-health outcomes in children and adolescents. So you might already be thinking that this sounds very similar to what the past review did. So I'm going to go over what those differences would be. So since the Saunders and colleagues review came out in 2015, a lot more people have pushed for these 24-hour movement behavior guidelines, Australia being one of them, and also the World Health Organization. So since this has happened in the last 5 years, it actually does require an update already. And in that review, there were only 14 studies included. So to expand that and try to find more evidence, I've changed a few things. So the first thing I did was revise the search strategy. So instead of just looking for studies that had physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep, I could find separate studies that looked at just sedentary behavior and sleep, or just sleep and physical activity. So it can encompass more things that way. The inclusion-exclusion criteria will also, well, it is a little bit different. In the past review, they had to have physical activity measured objectively and a minimum of 300 participants involved in a study. And I got rid of those because there are a lot of really big studies and international studies and things from different countries that using objective measures just wasn't really an option. And so to expand the data sets we're using and to be more inclusive of some lower income countries, I got rid of that criteria. I also added non-health outcomes because we know that individually physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep can affect other things such as academic performance. And since we know the combination affects health indicators, why not other things as well? So here's my Prisma diagram. After duplicates were removed, we had over 23,000 title and abstracts we screened, and in the original review they had just under 600. So this was the difference between the search strategies. Then we did full text review on over 1,000 studies, and now have over 150 studies included in the qualitative analysis. So for different outcomes, it's been kind of interesting. So we found what we expected. We looked at different diseases and fitness, adiposity, and then some more obscure things like academic achievement, mental health, impulsivity, and behavior. So there was a wide amount of outcomes that we found, which is pretty exciting. So we are still in the process of data extraction. All of them have been done by at least one reviewer, and in duplicate is still ongoing at the moment. So these results are highly preliminary, mainly from a narrative synthesis. But what we found so far is that academic performance in children looked at cross-sectionally, that children with higher physical activity and higher sedentary behavior had higher academic achievement. But when you looked at the longitudinal studies, the children with high physical activity and low sedentary behavior actually had the higher academic achievement. Now this little word cloud is all studies that showed more favor toward this combination of movement behaviors, so high physical activity and low sedentary behavior, or high physical activity, low sedentary behavior, and high amounts of sleep. So the words are based off how many, the sizes of the words are based off how many studies support this particular combination. And you can see there's this wide range from well-being to physical fitness, adiposity, and mental health. So there's a lot of support that the combination of behaviors is pretty important. And these are just a couple other outcomes that we found, but there were really only one study found for each, so we can't make any conclusive decisions off that. But we found impulsivity, bone mineral content. There's a lot of studies looking at it now. So something interesting that I found was when I looked at these studies, there were different ways to measure it in a lot of ways. Some people looked at how many recommendations the children met, or they might have made median splits. But one really popular one was isotemporal substitution. And what that was is when you take time from one behavior and substitute it with another. So example, 15 minutes of sedentary behavior to moderate physical activity. It was very consistent when they did this measurement that when they replaced sedentary behavior and light physical activity with vigorous physical activity, that there was a positive change in whatever outcome we looked at. So looking at the specific intensities of physical activity was really important across the board. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So as I mentioned, we are still in the process of doing the systematic review, but we are getting there with data extraction, and it should be done by the end of December. And when we get back from break, I'll start my data analysis in January and have it written and submitted by the end of March. So this brings me to my second study, which is exploring domain-specific time use profiles in children. So time use is what we've been talking about, looking at these different behaviors. So light physical activity, moderate to vigorous physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep, but in a 24-hour day, because we don't have more than 24 hours, which is unfortunate sometimes. So the way your day is made up is your time use profile. So you may see that some people have a moderate amount of sleep, or some people have a lot at the expense of their physical activity, for example. So there's a lot of different ways that your day can be split up based on your different behaviors. And since we found that these combinations of movement behaviors do affect health and other outcomes, I wanted to take a little bit deeper and look at the different domains of these activities, which could be how you're actually carrying them out or the context. So for example, for physical activity, you might have physical education classes for children, or doing it for fun or for active transport. And we have found that there are differences in which domain of physical activity you're using. There was a meta-analysis that found that leisure physical activity and active transportation was associated with positive mental health. But when you looked at household physical activity and physical education classes, there really was no association. So when you look at physical activity as a whole, you think, yeah, this is associated with mental health. But when you look at it domain-specific, that's not the case for all types of physical activity. A similar pattern was seen with all-cause mortality, which was found by another meta-analysis that found that leisure time physical activity and sports had a decreased level of all-cause mortality than active transportation and just kind of walking for your primary mode of physical activity. Going into sedentary behavior, when you're talking about health, people always think, oh, sedentary behavior is bad. But this isn't necessarily the case. We always need to do it at some point. But they do have different outcomes. So if a child, for example, is reading a lot, they might be improving their cognition or their academic performance if they're doing homework. But if you're watching an excess of TV that can do the opposite, it can actually decrease cognitive function and increase aggressive behaviors. But even this done in proper amounts can have some social benefits if kids are playing games with their friends and other sorts of things. So again, the domain of sedentary behavior does have some differences. Speaking of sleep, it might sound kind of weird because how many ways can you actually sleep? But there are differences, for example, in location. So children that fall asleep in their bed tend to have better quality sleep than children that fall asleep in other places. And the time of day is also important. So naps have actually been shown to help retain information in the academic sense. And nighttime sleep, we're pretty familiar with that. It has a lot of health benefits. So what I'm interested in looking with these different domains of physical activity are the different disparities in child movement behaviors and socioeconomic status. So socioeconomic status for a child is actually based off their parent because they're not, going to work and paying bills. So socioeconomic status can be measured by their parents' educational attainment, income, or their occupation. And the disparities in these movement behaviors, if you look at it as a whole, physical activity and sleep are higher up in children from higher SES families, but information is kind of mixed on sedentary behavior. Some people say low SES experience more, some people say high SES is more, so it's a little contradictory there. But if we go over to this little visual, this is a graph breaking down each movement behavior by domains. So the red is indicative of high SES children, and the low is low SES children. So if you look at sport participation, that's definitely high SES, but screen time is definitely low SES. And then if you go over to sleep, there have been some studies supporting that naps are more frequent in children from low SES families. So it seems like it's more concrete when you look at it by domain, but we haven't really studied this in a time-use perspective yet, which is what I would like to do. So what I'll be doing are these questions. So what are the different time-use profiles regarding the overall quantity of physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep among children? What time-use profiles can be identified regarding different domains of children's physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep? And finally, does the socioeconomic status of a child's family predict profile membership in time-use profiles regarding overall physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep, and domain-specific time-use profiles? So to figure this out, I'm going to use the data set from the longitudinal study of Australian children. This was started in 2003 with 2 cohorts. There's the birth cohort, or cohort B, and the K cohort, which were 4 to 5 when they started. And they collected data every 2 years. The data that I'm interested in are from the time-use diaries and interviews because they go into specific domains of different behaviors and the context in which they were in. So I will be using data from the B cohort, or the birth cohort, from 2015. And these children were aged 12 to 13, and I'm going to be using this wave because it's the most recent, and we know that we're in a world that technology changes all the time, so data from here is going to be the most relevant to what kids are doing now. So to answer questions 1 and 2, those are the questions about the different movement behavior profiles. I will do a cluster analysis, so that will group children into behaviors with other children that also have similar behaviors. And I plan on making a visualized radar chart with a reference group. I'll show you what that is. So this is just a hypothetical chart, but what I would like to do is here I have my reference group, which is in the blue, and if you look at the orange group, which is cluster 2, you'll see that they have 4 times the amount of naps. But cluster 3, or the gray group, are active transportation, 5 times the amount as the other group. So it could be really interesting to see what these different profiles mesh up to be. Finally, to answer my third question, which is about SES predicting which profile they're in, I'll use a multinomial logistic regression. So this is my timeline. I've been in contact with my supervisors and we've been talking about this a lot, so we're pretty happy with what we have so far. So in January, when we get back from break, I'll request my data set from LSAC, and right after I submit my systematic review, I'll start doing data analysis in April, and it'll be done by the end of July. This will bring me to my third study, which is the association between childhood time use and social mobility. So social mobility is a change in social status, and it can be measured very similarly to socioeconomic status. So by education, occupation, or income. So this can happen within a generation or across generations. So within a generation, if you get a promotion, you experience upward social mobility, where if you lost your job, you can experience downward social mobility. And across generations, for example, if my father graduated with a high school diploma and I graduated with a university degree, then I've experienced upward social mobility. Now, what I want to look at with this is, do different time use profiles in childhood lead to shifts in social mobility outcomes in adulthood? And then I would like to identify mediators between childhood time use and social mobility trajectories. Now, I do think that potentially children that have a more healthy time use can experience social mobility, because if you look here, if we have a healthy time use, you have increased physical activity and sleep, which increase your health and cognition, and your sedentary behavior is also associated with better health. So if you're thinking about it, like if you're a healthier child going to school more often, you might be getting better grades and want to attain a higher education at some point. And when you're getting jobs, you're not going to be calling in sick as often. But these, I mean, it's a very loose thing, but these different activities, especially physical activity, have been shown to show ways to foster social mobility. So for example, in physical activity, children can learn capacity building, which has a few definitions, but this one was specifically for health education. And it is a long-term process through which, in our case, individuals, organizations, and societies obtain, strengthen, and maintain the capabilities to set and achieve their own development objectives over time. Now, this is important because children in lower SES families, it's harder for them to climb the social mobility ladder, but if at a younger age, through physical activity and a healthy time use, if they are fostering this capacity building, they might have a better chance of experiencing upward mobility later on in life. So to test if this is true or not, I've looked at a few potential data sets. We're still deciding on what we're going to do. But for example, the RAIN study has over 30 years of longitudinal data over several generations. And it has information on all the different movement behaviors and a lot of other data regarding families and neighborhoods that could be potential mediators. So to do this, I'm going to first identify movement behavior time use trajectories, compare them with social mobility trajectories, and finally identify potential mediators. So I plan on finalizing this in July when I'm finishing up my second study, and then after I finalize exactly what I'm going to do, I will work on this till the end of 2021 and have it done by the end of the year. So the next slide is just an overall timeline. So 2020, I'm going to be finishing data extraction up soon, and I'll turn in my third study at the end of 2021, and through January to May of 2022, I'll be writing my thesis and be able to submit it on time by the end of May. So thank you very much for your time, especially to my supervisors. I know you guys hold us at a very high standard and have a lot of patience for us, so I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, does anyone have any questions?